It's a pleasure to be here. As we said before, I think this is obviously a tremendous event. The way we want to, or I think we structured the panel discussion here, that we have two esteemed members in addition to myself, Carlos Peña, who is the director at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA. And then we have, to my left here, or your right, Michael Zinger, who is the CEO of Brainscope, which is an EEG based TBI diagnostic company. And so the goal of the session, we're shifting a little bit gears, as I tend to say, and maybe you call it shifting in reverse, I call it shifting into forward here, that we really wanted to highlight what are some of the challenges, but also the opportunities, some of the gaps, to really take a discovery, this being a biomarker discovery or what we would call a device, all the way to the bench side with an example now from TBI, and then Carlos will outline to us what the regulatory framework is. So the way the session would run is Carlos will start with an outline of what we may call regulatory framework, a few slides. I know we haven't seen enough slides yet, definitely need to see a few more, so bear with us as well. And then Michael will follow up with really what's the path to commercialization. We all say we can do it, but what are really, I think what we're trying to convey here, that this is potentially a winding and long road, and really how can we maybe streamline the process here. And then we'll open this up, we'll have a discussion on the panel here between the three of us with some discussion, with questions we thought would be important. That will probably take another 15 minutes or so, but most importantly, would like to engage you, the audience, for the last 15 minutes into really open questions. Unique opportunity here to have the FDA present as well, and someone who again has worked in the commercial space. So now is the time to ask about the secret sauces and how it's actually real done. So Carlos, if you wouldn't mind to start.
Sure. So thank you and good afternoon. I appreciate the meeting organizers for inviting FDA to be here with you today. My name is Carlos Peña. I'm the director for the Division of Neurological and Physical Medicine Devices at the Center for Devices at the FDA. And the focus of my presentation targets three areas. One is giving a brief overview of medical device regulation and some products that are relevant to today's meeting. The second one is a few considerations for diagnostics and therapeutics as it relates to TBI and PTSD. And then the third is best ways to engage the agencies and who to contact for more info. And before I move to the next slide, I'd like to do a little bit of a test. I'm going to go off script a little bit. And I would like everyone in the audience to turn around and introduce themselves to the person behind them or next to them or around them. Because I bet you the different rows, you don't know who's behind you. And tell a little bit about yourself. 30 seconds. So I appreciate that. I'm going to try to get you back now. But I can bet everybody that if you've introduced yourself to the person behind you or around you, you probably have the same goals of being here at the summit. You may even have met somebody who you exchanged a business card with, and you may even have met someone who you're probably going to be in contact with after this meeting to follow up on the brief introduction you gave. And I think that type of approach is what's going to be needed if we're going to be working together on these conditions, TBI, PTSD, and greater neurological and psychiatric disorders for our veterans. So I'm going to come back to that. But I think that's, we're sort of a patchwork here. No one person or no one organization or no one agency is going to be able to solve these issues alone. So the next slide, for those less familiar with FDA, at the FDA we have a guiding principle which is for the Center for Devices and Radiological Health to provide patients access to high quality, safe and effective and secure medical devices of public health importance first in the world. And we take this principle seriously with urgency, and we take a risk-based approach to our review. So at a glance here, the figure that you're shown and on this slide are about medical devices classified into 1, 2, or 3 classifications, with regulatory control increasing from class 1 to class 3. The device classification and regulation defines the regulatory requirements for any given general device type. And for example, most class 1 devices are exempt from submitting an application to FDA. Most class 2 devices require what's known as pre-market notification, and most class 3 devices require pre-market approval, the highest classification. We provide oversight across these 3 classes using tools known as general and special controls, for which we help to communicate to sponsors so that they meet their regulatory obligations. If we take a look at a few neurological and physical medicine devices in the marketplace related to this form for veterans and their families, they include a number of products, and I'm just going to walk through some of these that are listed here. These are just a few. They include devices for the assessment of head injury, to assist standard clinical practice to aid in the evaluation of patients, and my colleague is going to be talking to you a little bit more about just such a product. We have cleared devices for assessment of intracranial hematoma, also known as bleeds, for clinical evaluation in the acute hospital setting for patients. We have cleared medical devices to assess cognitive function following a possible concussion. They are intended as part of the medical evaluation that doctors perform to assess the signs and symptoms of head injury, and this includes both adult and pediatric devices. We have cleared medical devices for assessing cerebral cognitive functioning, and while not directly related to TBI and PTSD, we have cleared devices that improve the quality of life for our veterans and their relationship with the caregivers and families, which include prosthetics and exoskeletons. I would also like to note that the majority of these devices were cleared in just the last 3 years, so we are making progress. A question you might ask is that, is this an extensive list? Is this a comprehensive list? Is this a list that covers the areas that are of most interest to veterans? And I will just say that I propose it's a good start. It's a good start to building a list. And we still have a lot more work to do. Here's a little bit more information about what we do at FDA, and it is not an easy job. As mentioned in the previous slide, medical devices are classified into 3 types, 2 of which are listed here, class 2 and class 3. These are the higher risk classifications. And so, for example, we receive several dozen PMAs, pre-market approval applications, each year. These submissions are the highest risk and require clinical data, typically. These are class 3. A second pathway is the 510K submission, and we receive several thousand each year. They typically do not contain clinical data, but they can. And they are supported by mostly non-clinical data and bench testing and review of prior submissions that may have contained clinical data. These are typically class 2. Finally, a third regulatory pathway is the de novo submission process, which includes devices that aren't comparable to anything on the market and present a lower risk than other types of devices. These typically are called de novos, where we have granted a de novo. That particular product becomes the predicate to subsequent products, which can then move along the 510K pathway. For a number of devices I've just mentioned, they went through the class 2 and the de novo pathway. So the regulatory path also helps to move products to market, and not all devices are classified as the highest risk. So I'd like to now drill down a little bit into more detail about the development of both diagnostics and therapeutics with that background, as it relates to TBI and PTSD, as well as other neurological and psychiatric disorders and conditions. Here are just a few considerations that we take to provide a little bit more light on the questions that FDA may have about a medical device for you. So if we start with diagnostic devices, in general, these are just a few points to consider, but these are some of the things that we think through when we receive submissions from sponsors and investigators. Consensus is important in developing what the output of a device means and how it should be interpreted. This is especially true for disorders where diagnostic criteria for any given disorder is still being investigated and not well understood. TBI, PTSD can probably fall into this category. in some cases, FDA may require use of a best estimate diagnosis, where a blinded expert panel may be involved and majority consensus rules. And this can be related to the imaging and use of biomarkers for these conditions. And we do not recommend using the same data set to develop both a diagnostic or biomarker and validate the diagnostic or biomarker for use as a marketing submission approach. Usually these are best addressed in two studies where you sort of evaluate what you're looking at, whether it's a diagnostic or a biomarker, and then you do a study called a confirmatory study to further test out what you are studying. Moreover, a device or biomarker should reliably measure some aspect of brain function, EEG, eye movements, or structure. It's important to understand the limitations of the diagnostic, where it can be used and where it can't be used. You should have a good understanding of how a device works, what the output means, and how to use or interpret the information in the care of patients, and especially understand the consequences of when it's used incorrectly, as this speaks to the risk. And these are very sort of common considerations that we have, but they're really important because it really gets us a good feel, a good handle, a good understanding of the device's both benefit, the risk, the safety, the effectiveness, and the patient experience with that product, as well as the physician who works with the patient when using that product. And with regard to clinical considerations, a few highlights from the list include needing to define where and who will be using the product, the sensitivity and specificity of the device, and the need to identify whether baselines are required for clinical utility or versus a reference standard. And I would also like to mention that this is not an exhaustive list. Any development plan depends upon the technology, the target population, the indications for use, and these factor into the FDA review. And so on the first slide, I showed a couple panels of devices that had come through FDA. And it's not so much important to talk about the specific data sets, but that each of those panels in that first slide was reviewed and either cleared or marketed with approval based upon those qualities and attributes of the device. The review was tailored to make sure it understood those attributes. And I'm going to come back to that. On the therapeutic side, a few points to consider. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but what is the type of trial design that you're using to evaluate your device for safety and effectiveness? How are you identifying what your product does? What is the clinical truth of your device? And are you testing what your device does in a well-controlled study? Is your study generalizable to the broadest population? Oftentimes, we like to make sure your product is most beneficial to a particular patient population, and at the same time have the broadest beneficial impact. That's not an easy walk to take. And what information is needed by the user and the patient to use the device safely and effectively? These are all challenges that we work with sponsors during the development of a product. So a few take-home points. For diagnostics, establishment of gold standards, diagnostic criteria is key when evaluating a device, taking into account the heterogeneous clinical presentation of many neurological and psychiatric disorders. And the use of sensitive clinical outcome assessment tools is important. Similarly, on the therapeutic side, I mentioned a bit about the trial importance, clinical outcome measures, and the value of well-controlled studies. And the best way we implore with sponsors is to come approach FDA as early as possible, because if we can clarify our expectations, we can understand what the device, from the sponsor's perspective, from the investigator's perspective, they are on a track to move as quickly as possible to the marketplace. And this occurs in what's called a Q-sub process or pre-submission process, usually where these early discussions occur. If folks are thinking that, well, I'm kind of in the animal study phase, it's really too early to approach FDA, that is the opportune time to approach the agency, because not only can we comment and advise and share our recommendations on animal studies, which are costly, and we like to limit those studies to only what is needed, but we can also advise on what type of non-clinical information preclinical animal data would be needed to move to human studies. And that's a very important next step. We've also made some progress in that area on investigational studies. I think in 2011 it took FDA approximately 400 plus days to review and get to an approval decision on investigational studies. That's down to 30 days as a median time. That has not come easy. That's been at a cost. But I think we are looking for ways to sustain that. And one of the ways that we are finding most effective, most successful, is working with and communicating and talking to sponsors and investigators. Bottom line is that if folks are considering developing a diagnostic or a therapeutic for TBI, PTSD, a neurological or psychiatric condition, it would be very advantageous to talk to FDA. So a few closing thoughts. And I'm over, but I want to get to some closing thoughts I think will be helpful to this forum. Our job at FDA is to assure the safety, effectiveness of products, a wide variety of medical products, including medical devices and neurologic psychiatric conditions. TBI, PTSD is an area that we very much want to support. I thank the meeting organizers again for having FDA come to this forum. We have a new division of neurological and physical medicine devices. It is one of the newest divisions at CDRH, and we are quite proud of this bold investment of the agency in this area. Next month, we plan to move from 3 branches to 5 branches. Right now, the branches include neurostimulation, neurointerventional neurosurgical, and physical medicine. We are planning to move to 5 branches, which include now neurostimulation neurology, neurostimulation psychiatry, physical medicine, neurointerventional, and a new branch which is going to focus on neurodiagnostics and neurosurgery. This is a big deal. If you think about diagnostics, they're a double threat because they can be involved in diagnosing conditions and they can be also involved in assessing treatment efficacy. Along those lines, we encourage, as we further build this division, to rapidly move as safely and effectively as possible devices to the marketplace. We encourage academia and industry, the investigator themselves, to consult early with the agency, which offers FDA staff the opportunity to clarify what data is needed to bring safe and effective devices to market. And 3, this is not a water to bear by just any one group or one entity alone. This area is going to take a form like this one, where ideas can be discussed, where they can be debated, where they can be challenged. And I think that if we think of us as a community, I think we'll have a lot more chances to make some significant, practical, meaningful steps for patients as we try to get products to patients, veterans who desperately need them. Thank you.
Thank you. So Michael, you're up. Just keep track of the time. I'm just looking at the time.
Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey at Brainscope. I figured, well, maybe this might be a little lighter than some of the others, but it'll also be maybe a little more personal. Let me start by saying I started at Brainscope almost exactly when President Obama was elected, which was in about 2008, as everyone recalls. And at that time, we were living through 2 wars, and we were living through a world economic crisis. Everybody remembers that time. And here I went naively into the world of neurological devices, happened to have the benefit of having a very wealthy backer, and decided I would do that. It's been quite a journey. And I'm here delighted to talk to everyone about what it takes. And I will say, Carlos, that what you've described is very much what we have been through with FDA. Everything that Carlos described is a lot of what we've done, and we're going to talk about that. So after sort of 8 years of development, we're still kicking, we're still going strong. It's an interesting tidbit. Some people may wonder, well, how long does it take to get a product to market, for goodness sake? How long does it take to get a medical device to market? I'm talking a true medical device. I'm not talking about a toy or an app. I'm I'm talking about a medical device. Typical timeline is between 8 and 12 years. So we're right on track. I'm at 8 years, the company's been around for 10. I think everybody knows this is a major problem, and this is one of the major reasons why we decided to go to DoD to talk to them about a solution that we thought we might have. At the time, we only had a general technology, and we approached the folks at MRMC, the Medical Research and Materiel Command at Fort Detrick, and I remember talking with Ken Curley and Dallas Hack and saying, I've got this technology, we've got a lot of work to do. And 8 years later, we're on the cusp of introducing a product. And it shows you just sort of the need that is happening. Also, I think it's fair to say that you can't miss what's going on in the news today. If you're an American and watching football or sports fan, there's a lot of interest in the topic, and so that helps. It helps that the DoD is interested. It helps the VA is interested. It's interesting to note that when we talk about the incidence rate of traumatic brain injury worldwide, we often say it stacks up to a whole bunch of other maladies put together. It has to do with population density. It has to do with population health and safety. You get a lot of head injury when you have dense populations. But you can see on the left there the increasing preponderance of TBI in emergency departments. I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but I want to just talk about the fact what happens when you bump your head. You bump your head, you go to the emergency department, and they look at you. There's so many clinicians here that I'm almost embarrassed to say this is a non-clinician to give this talk, but people will understand what I'm talking about. And they'll give you a GCS somewhere in the range of 3 to 15. And where a lot of people focus on is that mild 13 to 15. You're talking and walking relatively close to normal, not completely, of course. And that's about 95% of the population of head-injured patients. So that's what we sort of focus on at Brainscope, is what is it that, what happened? And does this person have a structural brain injury? And do they have a concussion? These are the kinds of questions that we're particularly interested in, right in that urgent care kind of space. And as we've looked at TBI, and this is perhaps the most rudimentary slide of the entire day, but what the heck. This is a spectrum, and TBI is characterized as being complex and heterogeneous. We know that. And we know that when you hit your head, that when you go to the emergency department, they're going to give you a CT, and they're going to look at that very far left end of the spectrum to see if you have something very large. I was having a lunch conversation today about this very topic, a colleague from UCLA. And so you're going to catch that, the clinician wants to catch that far left side of the spectrum. But what about the rest of the spectrum? So we're interested in both. But CT, as we know, is also imperfect. We were talking about that too with my UCLA colleague today. It's imperfect. It will catch the general broad things. It will catch, as some people say, the major vascular problems, but it's not going to catch everything. This is the same brain of one person, and this is what it looks like on the far left with the CT, and this is what it looks like as you move into more advanced imaging. So you could be called CT negative, yet you know there's all kinds of problems. And when you're developing a device, a diagnostic, to potentially say, hey, I think this person is CT positive or CT negative, that's your gold standard. That's what Carlos is talking about. You need a gold standard. And that gold standard for us, as an example, is imperfect, but it happens to be the gold standard in emergency departments. People say, why about MRI? Well, that's not what's happening today in emergency medicine. They just don't go and get an MRI. So when you frame the problem, you know that TBI, first of all, you know it's a highly subjective diagnosis except for the CT part, and you know that for the most part, most CTs are going to be negative. You know that about 90 to 95% of all CTs are negative. So there's a tremendous amount of over-CTing going on, and there's tremendous delays that happen, patient exposure to radiation, The average wait time, we did a major study, showed about 4.5 to actually 6 hours in academic centers that you're sitting there and waiting. And then there's not a whole lot of other information beyond neurological analysis. So there's a huge, huge opportunity for diagnostic technologies to help, to become additive. So first thing we believe is that any product has to address that likely CT positive or CT negative on the spectrum. If a product can do that, that can certainly be a good, very good first start. There's your gold standard in shining bright lights right there. CT positive, CT negative on the spectrum if you can do that. Second thing is can you provide vital, objective diagnostic information for the rest of the spectrum of injury? Not a lot of gold standards. I'm sure if we had a big debate here amongst all the experts in this room, we would debate about how you would define concussion. We're not going to do that. We're not going to try to have that debate. We want to give all kinds of diagnostic information because it is a clinical diagnosis. And that's what I want to talk about, which is we believe at Brainscope that the concept that is powerful is the concept of a multi-modal panel. We believe that the current standard is such that by giving the clinician the ability to do their clinical diagnosis, you are empowering that clinician to do their thing, to give them much more information. And the example we use for the panel is MI. And it's interesting because I've heard this over even today, but I hear it all the time. I get really pleased when I hear that. But the concept is that if you present to the emergency department with chest pain, and they'll give you an EKG, and then they'll potentially give you a troponin test, and then you might get some imaging, and you add all that up, and that's a panel. That's what happens, and then there's a clinical diagnosis thereafter. And that's what we at Brainscope want to try to accomplish. We want to try to empower the clinician to do all of that. And I'm not going to make this a commercial for Brainscope today and talk about that, but that's in general the way that we think about how the clinician can be empowered to make that decision. I do want to talk a little bit for a second about the overlap of TBI and PTS, and I actually want to make an offer for anyone in this audience, which is there's a very significant overlap. As we all know, there were Nobel laureates and the like that could talk much more about this eloquently than I can. But here's what I can say, which is they're so inextricably intertwined that it would be lovely if we could put that on the panel. We've done some of that at Brainscope ourselves, but I invite you to reach out to me. At the end, I'll give you my email, because no better place than to get the world experts here. And we'd like to put that in our panel as next generation, because they are so inextricably intertwined. And I throw that out as an opportunity for everyone here. So, purpose of this panel, not the blood panel or TBI panel, is to talk about what you do when you're creating a company. And I will tell you, it's been 8 years of development, and it starts off by trying to figure out if you have a clinical need, and you can see it as a major stair-step case, and I'm sorry that the writing is relatively small, but you can get the idea that there's lots of steps. You can get the idea that at any point in time, you can die. And I can tell you, Brainscope has been down that path. We've had our successes, and we've had our failures. We can tell you we had a major product problem early on and almost killed us, and we overcame it. I can tell you we've been to FDA more times than people can ever imagine. We're extremely proud of it, but it gets to what it sort of takes. And once you get that regulatory clearance, however, and people say, that's it, you're just beginning. So my 8 years, I'm just beginning. And so for those of you who are thinking about translational research, realize that, and I do have a PhD, it just happens to be in the dismal science called economics. And I can tell you that in the dismal science of economics, as much as people care about other people, they care a lot about returns. And when you are the CEO of a company, that's very, very important. So they're going to look at how you sell it and when you sell it. And how is it going to be paid for? How are we going to get it reimbursed? Spend a lot of time using my dismal science to get there. So we're kind of at that place where we're on the cusp of offering a product, and we're on the cusp of getting it to market. And at that point in time, we'll start to face the questions of who's going to buy it? Why are they going to buy it? What are the economics? So we've gone through all of the things that Carlos has talked about and done all of those studies. You are talking about years and millions of dollars. So there's that need for continuous fundraising. For those of you that have a lot of support from the NIH or other foundations or the like, we are a company, so we have to raise money on a constant basis. We have to measure our appropriate spend, what we'd like to do. I'm sort of known as scope creep king, and that can't happen all the time. And then there are different constituencies along the way that can be extremely taxing. Not to make it a downer, it's a long process. And there's a multifaceted nature of developing a diagnostic device from scratch, and it starts with clinical need, it goes to technology capability, and then there's strategic focus. And then there's my favorite, which always people sort of nod their heads, if those of you who've been in companies, and there's an acronym called DROC, which is don't run out of cash. And you'd be very surprised, maybe not surprised, how many companies face the valley of death, particularly in diagnostics, particularly in neurodiagnostics, around traumatic brain injury. And I could joke that our panel of all of our guests includes one panelist. So I say it jokingly, but with great sobriety. It's hard. And not running out of cash is tantamount. So my offer for those that are interested in adding to our panel with the PTS capability is get in touch with me, and we'll work together as we have with the DoD. It's a big shout out to the Department of Defense. We've received close to $30 million over 6 contracts. We would not be alive today without the DoD. There's no question about it. It's been an amazing partnership. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So we start the panel discussion now. Not that this is supposed to be a downer here, but on the bright side, as I tend to say. So maybe before you get seated, question for Carlos and maybe for Michael from a practical how to define endpoints perspective as well. We talked about the lack of a gold standard, the best estimate diagnosis. Can we dwell a little bit further in how would we develop this in PTSD or in TBI? Do we need to wait until TED initiatives and others have finished? We understand the molecular taxonomy, or are there any low-hanging fruits from an agency and then from a practical perspective?
So I'm just going to move over, move this valley of death.
No. That was not meant to be symbolically here. It's just I need to keep track of the time.
A couple things. I mean, one is that with regard to developing diagnostic criteria, there is work out there that's happening to put criteria, evaluate the current criteria, see if that's sufficient or whether there are challenges or limitations. Having FDA there in those discussions would be one step that would be helpful, because if there is criteria that's been developed but it's not being communicated or shared with the agency, we're going to be unable to be familiar with it, be experienced with it, to look seriously at it in the development of clinical studies or trials. So that's one thing that I think if folks are talking about this topic, to please approach us. The second idea that may be helpful is that we have a medical device development tool guidance where you can use endpoints or biomarkers, and that is a pipeline that we use to target those items, the biomarkers, the endpoints, outcome measures. And if it's novel, we will take a look at it. It'll go under review, and if it's found to be meeting this use that it purports to be used for, then we would use that and we would support its use in clinical studies that look at novel neurodiagnostics or therapeutics. So there are some tools. So there's a communications piece, but there's also a tools piece that I think could be helpful to this dialogue among various stakeholders.
Okay. Yeah, I would say this. We started, as I said, about 8 years ago, and we actually went through the whole pre-IDE process with the agency and talked about the gold standard. And I think at that time, from a TBI perspective, it was exceptionally clear that CT was the gold standard. I think things are beginning to broaden. I think there's a tremendous amount of learnings. What we've learned together in this space as examples from the industry perspective, and I imagine from FDA's perspective, is really quite remarkable. So I do think there will be a broadening of gold standards. I think it's tough on things like mild traumatic brain injury or, for that matter, PTS. But I personally can tell you from we've received thus far from FDA 3 clearances that the agency has been pretty open to thinking more out of the box, because there's a whole lot more literature that's out there today than there was certainly 8 years ago.
So maybe to follow up on this, was there any special consideration, economic, clinical evidence, and otherwise, to select the specific intended use, as we call? So it's not a standalone diagnostic. Brainscope, if we take this as an example, it's to rule in or rule out CT positive from CT negative, so the left side of the spectrum you selected. What went into those considerations? Was it just the status of the clinical science at the time of submission of the Q-sub, or?
Well, I can answer it from my perspective from industry. So from the perspective of industry, we had always wanted to go across the full spectrum since we started when I started. And the big problem was mild traumatic brain injury. That was the holy grail. And there's the ultra holy grail, which we can all imagine for the military and in sports, is that whole return to play, return to activity, all that sort of thing. That's the ultimate holy grail. And the question is, how do you get there? And as a company, you take a step back and you say, all right, how can we get there that will provide something that can be of great clinical utility to the clinician? And what we realized in talking to FDA was that it was going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to find a suitable gold standard for concussion and mild traumatic brain injury. So we made a sort of a laddering decision, a step one decision, that we would go after CT positive, CT negative, to sort of prove that. Because if you could prove the most difficult, I guess the easiest way to, where there's greatest injury, if you can prove that, then you can narrow down to the finer levels of injury. And that's what we have done. So we've started with the concept of proving out that CT positive, CT negative, and then at the same time we've continued to look at the full spectrum. You might remember my two slides where we definitively have that gold standard on CT positive, CT negative. We definitively don't have the gold standard on the rest of the spectrum. And so how do you do that? And our view is panel. So it's not, and our view is that a one-trick pony test. And I think this is the view of the agency. If you listen to what, as an example, Peter Como, one of Carlos's colleagues, has said in the public realm, and it's almost virtually quoting him, which is, there's not one single biomarker that's probably sufficient for this complex and heterogeneous disease. So therefore, multiple biomarkers to allow that clinician to do their full clinical diagnosis, so giving them those different data points, which gets you across that full spectrum. Because otherwise, that one-trick pony might get you to a quick triage, but then that's it. And that economically, from a business perspective, is very limited, and from a clinical perspective is also very limited as well.
Yeah, a couple comments. So, and I can't really speak about specific submissions, because then I would find myself in a much smaller room than the one that we're in here today. But
there's
a couple things,
today.
Right? A couple things is that when it comes to our review, we are trying to clearly assess the safety, the effectiveness of the product. the benefits and the risk. That's some of the points I made in my presentation. We want to make sure we can accurately attribute the device's therapeutic effect to the device in a well-controlled study. That requires for us to know about the target population. It requires us to know about what is comprised of that population. It requires us to know what is the claim that the device is making, and is that claim supported by the data that's been submitted? What is the indication for use? What is the technology consist of? What are the risks of the technology? So all these questions come into play in making sure that we can attribute the effect of that device, whether it's a neurodiagnostic or a therapeutic, in the review that we undergo. And sometimes we don't know the answer. Sometimes we will go to what we call a network of experts, which is a group of experts that we consult with, a variety of specialty organizations. And we should consider TBI and PTSD, making sure that those organizations are well represented on our network of experts. We may also go to panels, public meetings, where we talk about some of these products. So there's a number of things that we think through internally at the FDA, and then also sometimes we don't know the extent of a product. We may need consultation with experts on the outside, and we will fold that into our review process. I would love to be voted off the island panel for other companies to be here with you today, but I think it does require for us to ask some questions, which takes some time. I think Michael and I, we've known each other for some time. We agree on some things, and we may disagree on some things, but I don't think that the communication is unfounded or not based upon something that's important or challenging to work through.
Okay. So maybe to follow up on the clinical study design, and another follow-up for this, how important in your view, personal view or agency view, if you want it to be in a smaller room now, is the value of normative value of data? Is this where an investment should be made? Because that seems to be falling short. Everyone looks at the disease, and then there are the 20 control subjects, and we now control comorbidities as being the TBI, the emergency department, or PTS, PTSD is manifold.
Right.
So that seems to be traditionally, out of experience, underpowered, underrepresented.
Right. So, a couple higher level comments. Drugs and devices are a little bit different. So I think that's the first off, in that many times drugs studies are randomized control studies. Device studies, the evidence that we see should be represented as what we call valid scientific evidence. It can go from well-controlled studies to significant human experience. Principally, they are well-controlled studies that we base our decisions, but sometimes you may not need a randomized control study to evaluate the device's effectiveness. And that, so for example, prosthetics development, you may not need a randomized control study to evaluate what that prosthetic does for the patient. But having well-controlled investigations, having a way to measure the clinical truth and attribute the thing that you measure at the end of the study versus a control helps us with the uncertainty of how we measure, how we label that device and communicate what that device does in the labeling to the patient and to the clinician who's working with the patient.
Okay. And then I think you brought up, or maybe I misinterpret here, this biomarker qualification and drug development program. So that's separate, as we understand it in the industry, from the clearance approval of a specific device.
Right.
So I guess, as we see with TED, TBI, and other programs now, I know there is no, it's not written in stone, but what level of clinical evidence is actually required? I mean, how many replication studies with similar intended use would have to be done so it would fall into a qualification category? Are we looking at 1, 10, 100? Hard to say.
So it's hard to say. It depends, really. I mean, it depends upon what is before the agency in a submission. Yeah. There's a medical device development tool guidance that we have. It's online. There's an office with staff that helps sponsors move either the biomarker, the model, or the clinical outcome measure that you'd like to pursue. And there's a process in place for what that entails to be able to validate that for use in a clinical study.
Okay.
It's not in my shop, but there is guidance on that I think is very relevant to some of the discussions that have been.
And it also impacts statistical analysis plan and other considerations, obviously. So Mike?
Yeah. So I was going to say, we've done an enormous amount of studies for a small company, and the only way, by the way, we could have done it was because of DoD funding, but it's probably the only way we would have been successful. So we had two things that we did. First of all, we have the benefit of a core modality that has been around for a very long time, with set places that you can put on your head. And so we were able to access a very large database through translational research with the university from NYU to begin the process of seeing if it would, quote unquote, work. We then used our own capability to create our own normative data, which was expensive and significant, but we needed to do that to prove sort of what is a normal brain versus a brain-injured brain. So we needed to do that. And then so that was I wanted to address the normative topic, because we definitively had to do that. There's no way around it. And then in terms of validation studies, we have done a very significant validation study. And you sort of go through all the process of getting your CRO in place, and blinding the data, and submitting your SAP, and then waiting for the results. I can tell you that probably some of the hardest moments in my career over the past couple of years have been waiting for our independent biostatistician to give me the results. For those of you that have ever experienced that, it's you don't know if you've worked for 8 years for something or not. The study has to be sufficiently powered, and then it gets into write up to the peer-reviewed literature and the like. All to say that when you go in front of FDA as a company, all of this really is much expedited by being buttoned up. The more buttoned up you are, the better chances you are of being successful.
Okay. I think we're kind of at the 13-minute mark, so before I continue, are there any questions from the audience? Amit.
Thank you. Amit Etkin from Stanford. So I'm an MD, PhD psychiatrist and neuroscientist, so I can understand the FDA perspective and can conceptualize what that looks like. But I'm curious from the company perspective, something I've been learning about recently is the economic challenges when it comes to things like billing codes. So just to, my own ignorance is to bring others who are, perhaps at the same point I am on this. In psychiatry, we don't really have billing codes for a lot of diagnostic tests. And so certain companies like Myriad have been slowed down by having to basically try to get the billing system in place to be able to succeed with their product. So in psychiatry, how should we think about that? How have you thought about it in terms of you have this great product, but then how do people actually use it?
Well, I think it's core. So I think it's a core question, and it's a fundamental question. And having spent a career in medical devices, I was on the finance side for the first 10 years of my career, and then the last 15 or so have been on the business side. It's core, and you have to have that initial premise right up front before you'll be able to get your first penny of funding. A great idea or a great clinical need will only take you so far. So as an example, for us, as we look at the codes, we have taken a very, very deep dive look into the codes and have a pretty clear view as to how the insurance companies will assess the payment structure for our procedure. And needless to say, it is an incredibly involved process. I can tell you as an example, one diagnostic company in a completely different area where I was actually on the board of directors in cancer diagnostics and colorectal cancer. In order for them to get appropriate insurance coverage, they had to go to the preventive task force and get the preventive task force to set and to literally grade it as to whether it's a top test or somewhere in between, an A, B, or C. And if it were, as an example, an A, which it now is, all the insurance companies under the Affordable Care Act have to cover it. And that stock, which is a publicly traded company, when the initial preliminary task force came out, they said, we think there's not enough evidence, even though it was a New England Journal of Medicine piece. And the stock, which was trading at about $25 to $30, went to about $2 overnight because there was no reimbursement in people's eyes. And the company has done a brilliant job of actually proving, and eventually the task force came back and gave them that A, and the stock has now popped right back up. There was no difference in the fact that of sensitivity or specificity or clinical value. But yes, economics are vital. Absolutely. And do it up front.
Yeah, just to just follow up on Michael's comments, I think, FDA is likely not to get involved in the economics too much, but folks should be thinking about, the funding for research. There may be funding at research agencies. If they're smart, they're sort of initiating discussions with FDA, and if they're really looking ahead, they may, if the device is applicable, they should be thinking about CMS. And seeing what the questions they have for their reimbursement. Sometimes sponsors will say, I'm going to go individually with these agencies sequentially. Some sponsors will say, I'm going to design a study, or I'm going to put together my data set so it addresses safety and effectiveness, but then it's applicable to the questions of, for example, CMS that looks at necessary and reasonable. And so they may want to design a study that sort of has these different arms and attributes that may be applicable to more than one agency. And it really depends upon business decisions, not us, but business decisions, the technology, where they're at in the field. I mean, there's things that people should think through, though, down the line as well.
Maybe before we ask, just one comment, and then you can ask your question. So obviously reimbursement, maybe it's not so obvious, comes with an associated timeline as well, which can range from 18 to 24 months, depending if there is a code or no code. So if you do this by the time you have your approval or clearance document and you don't have cash in the bank, obviously you're toast. If we're looking at blood diagnostic tests just for frame of reference, and there is a code in place, it's currently reimbursed at around $17.52 if you run this in duplicate analysis. You don't make a lot of cash if you run 10 tests or so. This is just a couple of things to think about before we have dinner later today, but there was a question in the back.
Hi, Mark Miller from VA National Center for PTSD. Michael, I wanted to follow up on something you said about moving to the right side of the spectrum when you move away from the zone where you have a gold standard diagnostic test already in place into the space where there is no gold standard. You said that the solution, or one solution to that, or one approach to that, is through the development of panels. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more, kind of from a scientific and statistical standpoint, like how panel development allows you to go into the space without the gold standard to reference your new test with, and then also perhaps give some examples of what would be in a mild TBI panel using your devices.
Wow, what a great question. Superb question. So the concept of a panel is fairly used in a lot of different areas in medicine, which we could all talk about, because for those of us that have had a cardiovascular panel or a blood panel or whatever the kinds of panels that we get, there's different measures that we receive, and whether it's your HDLs or your LDLs and all those put together, those are the kinds of things in a panel that together the doctor will say, I notice that your cardiovascular panel would require you, as an example, to take statins because this is high and that is low and the like. So for us, what we have done is we've looked at a variety of elements around those kinds of measures. And so as an example, we would look at your EEG and compare that to an EEG of someone who was not head injured and say they might be normal, as an example. So you would compare that and wouldn't say, as an example, that that as a gold standard you are concussed. You're not saying that. What you're saying is well, this is one measure that would say, okay, I can see that your EEG would be outside of the normal range. Or it could be, as an example, a traditional neurocognitive test where you might look at reaction time, and you would have a normative database of normal reaction time based on age. And you would look and see how that would be, and then you would look at the person who had been head injured, and you would see how they were doing. You might look at somebody's ocular capabilities and see whether their eye convergence was normal or abnormal, and you'd add all that up. And those together give that clinician that capability to say, okay, I've noticed that maybe their brain function is a little off, and I noticed that their reaction time is a little slow, and I noticed that their eye convergence was a little abnormal, and I'm now going to make my clinical diagnosis based on that. And so our view is to continue to add to those kinds of capabilities, and if we can put that in the clinical flow, make it accessible. It's very important that it's accessible, because if it's not right then, right there, easy to use, it's not going to be used. And so it's at bringing all that together. And then what happens over time, we're back on this panel 2 years from now, those various measures go into algorithms that then get validated. So 3 of them together correlate to different outcomes and the like. That's where we as a company want to go.
Did you want to comment on the multimodality? So maybe, I know I don't know if there are any more questions. We only have 3 minutes left. Maybe we do some concluding remarks, what we've learned, what the future holds. Maybe just one comment again from an emergency department perspective. I think you brought something up important, and this is TBI related as well. What is really the value proposition to the person who would administer this? I mean, not being accessible. If this adds 30 more minutes to my workflow and the value is really unclear to me, I mean, we can discuss this until it blows out of our faces, as I tend to say. It will not be clinically adopted. So that's maybe something to think about. What is the practical implementation and the practical use to people doing this, and who are the people actually using this? Is it the physician? Is it the trained nurse? Is it a practitioner? Is it someone administering a test? Is it just a burden, or is it really a help? That's what I'm trying to say. So maybe with this, we have 2 minutes left. I promise to shut up now. I let Carlos to...
Well, no, let's make Michael go first. Then
okay. Oh, yeah, give me the easy one. So from an emergency department perspective, it's, as I said, it's, you got 4.5 hours of sitting there getting whether you're CT positive or CT negative. And ironically, I was in the emergency department on Saturday night with my wife who had an allergic reaction. And they said, well, what do you do? They gave her a CT to look at her stomach. And we sat there and waited and waited and waited for the results, which came back happily negative. So there's a lot of data and information that we can provide to help inform the clinician to make a much, much better clinical diagnosis beyond what they have today. And that's the gist of it. We don't think we'll add more time. We think we'll add more information and give them a whole lot more objective capabilities than what they have today.
I have probably a different closing remark in that there's a lot of money being poured into the research of biomarkers and diagnostics and therapeutics. And it would be a missed opportunity if we didn't realize those investments with actual products for patients. So whether folks are at academia, whether they're in industry, whether they're at the VA, the DoD, under research funding, we should make sure to manage the expectations of what is needed to get that product to market and approach FDA as early as you can, because it would be awful for us to end up down the road when we're looking at the data set and there's a difference of opinion in what one person thinks about whether the device is safe and effective versus another. And if those expectations can be matched at the very earliest stage of development, where we want to go down the line, I think that would create a lot of transparency, predictability, and it would be coordinated development among people with different perspectives and different goals, but the endpoint would be the same.
Well, thank you to the panel, to the panelists. Thank you to the audience. Thank you guys.